This is our second Checkmate Patterns video. Since checkmate is the way you win a game of chess, it's pretty important to know your checkmate patterns. This is Mate Patterns 2. We're going to cover basically three positions, three patterns, but two of them have a little bit of a variation. First of all, we're going to look at the Arabian Mate. And something that's a close cousin of the Arabian Mate is the Rookmate. We're also going to look at Pillsbury's mate, as we see in this one, and we'll also check out the Hammond mate, which is a version of the double trouble Rookmate. So let's head over to the chessboard. We're starting with the Arabian Mate. We have our knight in position, and the white rook comes flying over, captures that rook pawn for the checkmate. Arabian Mate is our rook and our knight working together for that checkmate. Now in this case, the king was in the corner, but it's not always going to look like that. In this one, we see a version of the Arabian Mate that's called the Rookmate, in which the knight is protected by a pawn and the rook gets in behind it. And it's kind of like a shape like a hook, the knight guarding that rook back there. Notice that there had been a check at f6, but that one doesn't work. The king escapes. So you have to be accurate in how you do these mates. Now this is usually the way you see a Rookmate, with that rook going into the corner, guarded by the knight, supported by a pawn. Now let's look at a couple of Arabian and Rookmates that are 2 and 3 moves deep. Here we see the queen sacrifice herself for that one rook, and then the next rook captures for the checkmate. In this one though, the knight quietly moves out of the way to the right square to guard the king's escape, and there's no stopping it. The next move, rook to G7 checkmate. And here we see a Rookmate that requires a sacrifice to deflect that bishop. The white rook wants to move into the e7 square for mate, but the bishop's guarding it. So we deflect it. We get it to move away with this check. After the bishop captures, now we can come in for the mate. And this is a very typical pattern in the Rookmate. The knight jumps out of the way, discovered check from the rook. When you move one piece out of the way and it opens a check from another one, that's called a discovered check. So the rook is delivering a discovered check no matter which way the king moves. If he goes to a7 or if he goes to c7, the pawn's going to push, and then mate is coming with the Rookmate. And notice he might go to a7 and then the same idea. All right, now let's talk about Pillsbury's mate. Pillsbury's mate is not the knight and the rook, it's the bishop and the rook. A lot of times it's going to involve a discovered check or a discovered checkmate. Here the bishop moves out of the way on the g-file, opening up the attack from the rook on g1, and the bishop retreated along this diagonal so that it still guards that corner square, h8. In this one, this is a 2-move checkmate. The bishop takes the knight, check, supported by the rook, so the king can't capture. He moves to the side, and now notice you retreat the bishop, but if you simply go back to e6, opening up the rook to check the king again, it doesn't work. Black has a bishop on h5 that will come and take your rook. So you have to be extremely clever and play bishop to g4, opening up the discovery from the rook, blocking the bishop from the h-file, and so this is actually checkmate. Now in this extreme example, we see a Pillsbury's mate in which the rook captures, check, but now if the rook moves away, if it retreats to open up the discovery from the bishop will get captured. So instead, the rook keeps the king in check. It's a double check. It's coming from the rook and from the bishop. Anytime it's double check, you have to move the king. You can't capture the bishop because it's still checked from the rook. And you can't capture the rook because it's still checked from the bishop. So the king has to move. He's going to capture, but now he's wide open on the g-file, and the other rook comes over for the checkmate, a Pillsbury's mate. Now that Pillsbury's mate was named after somebody, Harry Nelson Pillsbury, not the Pillsbury Doughboy. That's a different guy altogether. Here you can see the pattern, this open g-file, but the queen is of course preventing the rook from doing this checkmate. So Pillsbury in 1899 in a tournament in London against a guy named Lee plays queen f3 to deflect black's queen off of that g-file. The queen took, check, king moves over, check, king comes back, discovered check, with the bishop guarding the corner, and the only move was to block with a queen, and then checkmate. Now let's have a look at the double trouble rookmate. And one example is the Hammond mate, with 2 rooks on the 7th rank coming in for the checkmate. Now it's not always just sitting there for you, nice and easy to do. Here's an example, that same position, but a couple of moves earlier. The rook plays check, forcing the king in the corner, and then another check, forcing the king back, and now we're seeing the position we just came from, checkmate. And here we see the 2 rooks stack up like a rook stack on top of each other for this checkmate. And here, a couple moves before, check, check, and checkmate. All right, that's it for Mate Patterns 2. I'll check you later.